प्लीज विवेक जी स्टार्ट कर सकते हैं.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Okay, today I'll be starting with the unit block 2 of your booklet, which is the research methods, where I'll be talking about survey research method. I will be talking about ex post facto research method. Then I'll be talking about experimental research and field experiment, and last and not the least is a case study. Now, these all research methods. They are the combinations of qualitative and the quantitative research method. When I say survey research is a kind of a quantitative research method. Now, I hope you understand what quantitative research and qualitative research means. Quantitative research method, defines or has a meaning where we quantify something. For example, someone going to the market to buy something, or for example, you go to the market and ask the shopkeeper that you want 2 kgs milk. So that 2 kg is the number which is being quantified. So that is quantitative research method, where you do the statistical analysis by coming up with by coming up with some number which suggests something, or the thing that you're trying to measure. So where a measurement is being done, where you're trying to analyze something with the help of the statistics, that is what is quantitative research method. The qualitative research method, on the other hand, is a research method where you don't do quantify, but you use case study, you use interviews which are more subjective in nature. Now, for example, taking an interview is a subjective method. For example, an organization want to hire employees in their organization. So what they will do is they will do an interview of different employees who on the basis of whatever process they are going for. So over there, the research questions would be based upon different categories, and the answers would be again subjective in nature. So that is one of the example of the qualitative research method. Now, if I go on to survey is a quantitative research method where you're trying to come out with a conclusion with the numbers. Is the most one of the most important area of research in social science is the survey research. Like, for example, when we when there are election days or election times, what happens is that we go through, or you probably hear in the news channels as well, every news channel, that this is the percentage of this party to be to be the party of this year or for the next 5 years. So that is what is a survey research, where you are trying to come up with the viewpoints of the people by asking them questions. So survey research ke under it's about asking the questions and getting the viewpoints of the people there and then. Now, next is, what are the steps that are involved in conducting survey research? Obviously, when you do a research, probably a survey research where you are asking questions to the people or you getting the responses from the respondent, there are some steps. There are few procedures that are supposed to be laid upon by the researcher. The first is what we talked yesterday. The first is, you need to know the aims and objectives of the study. For example, during as an example that I have just given is, that you are taking the viewpoint of the people, that which party they're gonna be voting, or which party yes they will be voting. So what is happening over here? The objective of the research on those times is to see which party has the possibility or occurrence of winning this time. After you select the aims and the objectives of the study, the second is define the population. It's very important to define the population. Yesterday we talked about what is population and what is sample. So it's very important to define the population. Once the population is defined, then you start designing a survey. Then you start designing a survey. Now, when you design a survey, you have different questions that you think gonna be asked during the survey process. Now, for example, you would select a telephonic interview as one of the method of taking the interview or asking the questions from the respondents and getting the responses from there. So after that is done, after you construct a survey and design a survey, it's important although that to select a sample out of population. Which sample would you be taking? Now the sample has to be a true representative of the population. If not, then it can affect the research. Now, I hope you are clear with what is population and sample. This we talked yesterday as well. Population, for example, is a Chandigarh, and the sample would be selecting few sectors within the Chandigarh area. That is what is defined as the sample. After that, administering the survey, for example, if you are using the what kind of instrument you are using, what scale you are using, what questionnaire you are using, you administer, you go to the the sample that you have picked up, you go to them, you ask the respondents to fill up the responses of in the questionnaire itself. After you do that, then you do the interpretation of the responses, interpretation and the findings. For example, what are the responses that the respondents have filled up, and what is the interpretation towards those responses? For example, what would be the the results of the responses that the respondents have put in? After that, you prepare the report of the survey, and then is the that you put across the findings by getting it published in one or the other published journals. After this is what are the different methods that we use in collecting data through survey research. The first is the sampling. Now, what is sampling? Sampling is a process of doing or getting the responses from the respondent. Now, for example, whether you do probability kind of a sampling or non-probability. Probability means where every respondent has the equal, or every participant in the population has the equal chance of getting the being chosen by the for giving the responses. That is the probability sampling. Non-probability is where everyone does not have the equal chance to be the part of the representative. If someone's mic is on, Riddhi ma'am, can you switch off your mic, please? Thank you. Next is everyone is am I loud enough? I mean, clear ho raha hai sab kuch? Just say yes or no, whatever. I mean, is everything getting clear? Right. Thank you. After sampling is the questionnaire. Questionnaire is the statements that you make to develop a survey. The questionnaire that you use, the kinds of questions that you put across on the basis of the problem, or on the basis of the the aim that you have chosen to make a survey. So questionnaire has different, it can be administered, the questionnaires can be administered to the sample in different ways. The first is your mail survey. In mail survey is that you send across the questionnaire to the respondents or to the sample, and you get the responses back. Or you do it through group administered questionnaire. For example, if you are if you are residing in the same area that you have selected as your sample, you call the people in a group, you get the responses from the respondent, and that is what is a group administered questionnaire. Next is your household drop-off survey. For example, you go to houses, you go to to every house of the selected sample, and you ask them to fill up the responses. That is the household drop-off survey. Next is interview. Now, interview is a kind of a technique or a tool where it's a face-to-face interaction between the respondent and the researcher. For example, interview can be done into three different types. First is a structured interview. Second is your unstructured interview. Third is your semi-structured. Fourth is your telephonic interview. Now, what is structured interview, unstructured, and semi-structured? For example, before conducting a research, if I'm taking interview as a method of getting the responses from the respondent, for example, I think, okay, I'll make about 15 to 20 questions, and on the day of the interview, I'll ask the respondent first question, then I get the responses of that particular question. Then I move on to the next question, second question, I got the responses. I've moved to the third question, I get the responses, and so on. I will be asking the questions in the same serial order that I have put the questions into on the question that I have with me, and I keep on asking and getting the responses till I don't move on to the next question. That is a structured kind of an interview, which means I have a structured format of questions along with me. I will ask every question to the respondent, and while asking, I'll get the responses, and I'll note down the responses. On the basis of the responses, I would interpret the interview. Now, that is a structured interview. Next is semi-structured. Now, what happens sometimes when you are taking an interview, for example, you have the format of questions with you as in structured interview. Sometimes what happens is the respondent's responses are in such a way that you think that you need to either add on some questions or you need to delete some questions. So on the basis of the responses, we either add or delete the questions. And because we are doing it in the format, that is what is defined as the semi-structured. As the word says, semi means half, which means it is half structured, and half you edit according to how the interview goes, how the respondent responses are coming. That is semi-structured. And the last one is the unstructured interview, which means there are no set format of questions along with you. You just start with, as it happens, when you go for an interview to be hired in an organization, they ask you, okay, introduce yourself. You introduce yourself, and then the question comes up on the basis of the responses that you do. That is called the unstructured interview. The fourth one is the telephonic interview, the interview that can be done telephonically, while asking be on the phone, and the researcher asks the questions, and the respondent responses are noted there, and then while being on the telephonically, that is telephonic interview. Now, what happens during these days? Telephonic interview is very into demand. The organizations, what they do is they do the telephonic interview first, and then they go with the next process. So telephonic interview is very important these days. Now, next is types of survey research. When I say types of survey research, there are basically very two important research, surveys, which is cross-sectional survey, and the second one is the longitudinal survey. Now, what is the difference between these two? Cross-sectional survey, or we call it a cross-sectional research method as well. Cross-sectional, as the word says, that you try to study different sections of the society at the same time. For example, if I want to see, or if I want to measure the attitude of the people by or I have a comparison, I want to do a comparison study between urban and rural people to know their attitude towards something. So what I'll do in this, I'll put all the section of the society and I'll do a research. So my research is possibly employing, or the respondents would be all the sections of the society, because I'm taking rural and urban section, or the rural I'm taking rural and the urban society into my research project. So that becomes a cross-sectional survey, and because I'm adding all the sections of the society, that becomes my cross-sectional survey. Now, the next is the longitudinal survey. Is it clear to everyone till here? Just say yes or no, or do you want me to repeat something? So you can always put onto the chat box if you have any problem somewhere. Now, next is longitudinal survey. Now, the cross-section is because you are covering all the sections of the society. On the other hand, the longitudinal research is a research or a survey that goes for a longer period of time. Longitudinal, as the word say, is for the longer period of time. For example, my research is that I have to collect data or from the sample today, and then after 6 months, and then after 6 months for continuously on for 2 years, which means for 2 years I have to collect data from the same people 4 times. So that research where I'm taking so much longer period of time because my responses has to be checked upon, that becomes the longitudinal research. As the word say, a survey that is done for a longer period of time, because the viewpoints of the people might change according to time. So I want to see whether the responses of the respondents changes with time, or do they or are they same, or are they similar in nature. So that becomes the longitudinal research. Now your survey, your research can be based upon both cross-sectional and longitudinal, or just cross-sectional or just longitudinal, depending upon what kind of research am I doing, what variables am I picking to do my research, what are my variables, मैं किस चीज पे कर रहा हूँ, what are my aims, what are my objectives. Next is okay, longitudinal research के under longitudinal research there are trend studies, cohort studies, panel studies. All these 3 types, they involve different kinds or the treatment that is being given during the survey process. Next is types of questions in a survey question. The first is the structured questions. What kind of questions am I putting depending upon what kind of research I'm doing, what topic am I picking up to do the research on. Will be like the questions would be based upon such phenomena, that what is my research area, what is my aim, what is my objective, what are my variables, मेरा independent variable कौन सा है, what is my dependent variable. So I have to pick up all those things while doing a survey research. The first is the dichotomous questions. When I say structured questions, you would have come across online as well or somewhere that there are some questions where your answers are based upon either yes or no. So that is dichotomous questions. Dichotomous means splitting into different subparts. So when I say a question, when I put a statement and my answer or my response should be either or yes or no, so I'm splitting into 2 different parts. So which means either the response has to be yes or no, or for example, when you when you are filling up some forms, there's always a column of a gender, either male or female. So you pick one. So that is dichotomous kind of an questions or dichotomous statements. Next is level of measurement. Level of measurement, I would be measuring some statements depending upon, for example, do I agree, do I disagree, do I moderately agree, do I moderately disagree. So that is the level of the measurement. Or sometimes there are statements that ask you, okay, give the ranking 1 to 10, where 1 is the least and the 10 is the most. So that is the level of the measurement based questions, where the responses can be varied on for each respondent from 1 to 10, where 1 is the least and the 10 is the max. Third part is based upon filter or contingency questions. Again, sometimes your statements will be based upon yes or no. If you say yes, then you are asked further questions. If your answer is no, you are again asked further questions. So that is what is called the contingency questions. Next is your unstructured questions. Unstructured, as the word says, there is no such format with you. Your respondents, your responses will be, or the question that you will be asking from the respondent will entirely be based upon the responses that the respondent given during that particular period. So that becomes the unstructured kind of the questions. Okay, clear to everyone till here? Any question from anyone? Yes, sir. Okay, yes, sir. What does that mean? You have a problem, or is it clear? Okay, I assume it's clear.
Hello, sir. Can you explain filter questions again?
Sorry, ma'am?
Filter questions. That is.
Okay, filter questions. Ma'am, for example, sometimes what happens is, algorithms in 10th, where we used to study algorithms in 10th, where, you know, if your response is yes, you go there. If your response is no, your response is again, based upon the responses that you give. वही चीज filter के अंदर होती है. For example, the question that they have given in your book is, have you ever regularly attended the library of your university? If you say yes, then again it asks you further questions, once in a month or twice in a month or every week of the month or each and every day in a month. That is the filter or the contingency questions.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
You're most welcome, ma'am. Okay, next is your advantages and disadvantages of survey research. Survey research has the following advantages. It is convenient. It does not take much time. For example, if you want to do a research, you have 2 questions. You forward your 2 questions to the respondent. Depending upon how many questions do you have, lesser the question, lesser the time it will take for the respondents to respond you back. It is convenient, best possible, because you have a button clicked, you send across, you put your names of the respondents, the data will be sent to them, you get your responses back. That is how the survey is done. It can be done, online surveys are done sometimes you go to the respondents, get the survey done. Depending upon how you do it, it becomes the convenient kind of method of taking the information from the respondents. It is less time taking, it's economically for the researcher. You don't have to spend so much of money if you do it online. So next is, the survey can be conducted for a longer period of time. We just read about the longitudinal survey. So the survey can, depending upon what you are looking for, depending upon what your objectives or your hypothetical questions are, the survey can even take longer period of time. It can go for years and years as well. Sometimes depending upon what survey you are looking for, what are you actually looking down from a survey research. Next is that the researcher gets a full chance to well organize and present the reasons of the study. The researcher, for example, if the researcher is studying something variable that would take 4 years, 5 years, it means that an in-depth kind of a study is being done by the researcher. So it depends upon, again, what the researcher is trying to do. Disadvantages is maintaining the privacy of responses of each respondent under a group interview is questionable. Sometimes what happens is that you are taking a research. For example, if I'm doing a survey of a particular organization, by getting the responses from the respondent, and the respondents in the organization are the employees, and you get the responses in that particular sense, in that particular way, the responses that you're getting from the employees, it is actually becoming a it is breaking the norm of the ethics of the research by breaking the privacy component. Obviously, if you're getting the responses from the respondent and you get it published, or it is being shown somewhere in the newspaper or in magazine, or somewhere, it will break the privacy of the researcher. So that is one of the disadvantages of the research. High attrition rate of the respondents might hinder the longitudinal based research. Sometimes the respondents, they don't give the actual responses. They just click. If it's online, they just click it every day, in a very hurriedly way, and therefore it can actually hamper the efficiency of the research that the researcher is trying to do. Now, am I clear with the survey research? Should I move on to the next research method? Hello? Okay. The next research method is ex post facto research method. Now, ex post facto research. Ex post facto research method is the research method, where the work of the researcher is to predict the cost of something that has already occurred is known as the ex post facto research. For example, what happens sometimes is that researcher has done the experiment, but he wants to predict something on the basis of before the experiment can be done. For example, if I want to know a behavior of someone, for example, a behavior which is not a right behavior, I want to know the reason why a child has shown a wrong behavior. So I would go to the reasons for that. I will ask the parents, I would ask the teachers if it's a child, I would ask to the relatives of that particular child, I would ask to the neighbor of that particular child, so that I come to conclusion that why such behavior has occurred, why such behavior has taken place. Because remember one thing, as a psychologist, as from a psychology background, it is very, very important for us to understand any behavior. For example, a person who is crossing the red light, why is he crossing the red light? Probably because he's in hurry, because probably he has some emergency to go on. So it depends upon, sometimes our behavior that is a wrong behavior is because of some very important thing. And that particular person who is in hurry, he only knows why he has crossed the red light, why a person has done something wrong. Because sometimes what happens, the environmental conditions are in such a manner that we do something which is not accurate, which is not right to do. So, but it's very important as a psychologist, if you're working as a psychologist, or even if you are working as a researcher in the field of psychology, it's very important to understand the cause. So this is what the ex post research method talks about, that the researcher predicts the possible causes of the effect that has already occurred, why such behavior has actually happened. We need to know the reason for that. As a psychologist, when you work as a counseling psychologist or a clinical psychologist, sometimes things just go on, and you have to see where the cause has been. You need to understand the cause of such a behavior, and it happens in this particular kind of research, which is ex post facto research method. Now, next is characteristics of ex post facto research. The first is that the research has a control or a comparison group. There are two kinds of groups that will be there in the ex post facto research. One is the experimental group on which the experiment is done, and second one is the control group on which there's a neutral thing that happens within the group. Next is the behavior, action, event, or the treatment or the independent variable of the research cannot be manipulated or changed. In ex post facto research method, in this particular kind of research method, the independent variable is not altered, it's not manipulated, it's not changed. The research focus is on the effect, because we need to know the cause of the behavior. To understand that, that's what this particular kind of research it focuses on. The research tries to analyze how and what aspect of an event. Why did it happen? What made it happen? You need to know the reason. What made that particular person to act like that? If the behavior that was shown was wrong, why did that behavior has been inculcated by the person? Why did he went through that particular behavior? Next is explores possible effects and causes. Now, there's a difference between an experimental research method and an ex post facto research. Now, it's very important to understand first experimental research. What is experimental research? Experimental research is a kind of a research method in which we conduct experiments. Now, for example, let me give you an example for experimental research. For example, they are, it's a month left for class 12 board exams, and you want to study the students who are appearing for board exams, and you want to study the exam anxiety. This is what the example that I gave yesterday as well. So in experimental method, what will happen? I'll just give you an example for this. That, for example, out of 100 students, you saw that 80 students are having high stress during exams. So, as a psychologist or as a researcher, you want to lower down their exam anxiety. So, what you will do is you will do a meditation with them. You did a meditation, and meditation did put an effect on their exam anxiety, and their 80 students exam anxiety came down, which meant that yes, doing an experiment of meditation as a method to lower down the exam anxiety of the students, therefore it did proved right. Therefore, this is what the experimental method is, that you try to experiment on something to see whether that particular treatment would give an effect or not. In this case, the experimentation was done on the students who had exam anxiety by proving whether the meditation will work, whether the meditation will give an effect or not. That is what an experimental research method talks about. Am I clear with everyone? Am I clear to everyone? कोई तो yes बोल दो. Anyways, okay. Now, the important now is to understand the difference between experimental research and ex post research method. In experimental research method, the researcher manipulates the independent variable, whereas in the ex post research method, there is no manipulation of the independent variable, because हम यहाँ पर cause को देखने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं in ex post facto research method. There is a difference given over here. The researcher can manipulate variables in experimental research, whereas the researcher cannot actually manipulate the variables in the ex post facto research. Okay, now there are some steps of ex post research. I won't go into much. I'll just see if there is a difference that we have already done, because we've been doing steps before. I've done before as well, and I've done it yesterday as well. So I won't go deep into it. I'll just repeat what steps are there. Steps of ex post research: first is determining the problem. Second is literature review. Now, literature review means that you review the researches that has already been done in relation to your variables that you're trying to study. For example, you are trying to study something where you're trying to exam anxiety can be one of the example, and you will go on the literature review by reviewing the research that has already been done on exam anxiety. So that is what is literature review. You review your literature, you review your variables by looking into the research that has already been conducted in the same variable that you're trying to study. Next is formulation of hypothesis, designing the approach, validity of the research. It's very important whether the research is valid or not, whether you are trying to, whatever you are trying to do through research, is it a valid research or not? Will it affect the society? Will it help the society or not? Next is interpretation of the conclusion. Are the steps that are given for ex post facto research method. Now, next is strength and weaknesses of ex post research. Again, the strength of it is that the variables that you're trying to study cannot be manipulated is one of the biggest strength of this particular research, because you cannot change, you cannot play with the variables during this particular kind of research. This research is basically done in a sociological manner. For example, to study the variables that are within the society. For example, to understand the aggression of a student or to understand the aggression of adolescents, we need to pick up the children or the adolescents who are part of the society. So we try to look into not just the psychological component, but also the sociological component as well. It is more useful than the experimental research. Jesse, in experimental research, we try to look into the cause-effect relationship. But in ex post facto research method, we look into the causes more than something else. Whereas in experimental research, we look into the cause-effect relationship. What caused to what, and what is the effect of that particular cause is what is termed as the example of the experimental research method. It is less time consuming as well as it is economical. The weakness of ex post is that the researcher cannot manipulate. Now, because the researcher cannot manipulate, it is also the limitation of the ex post research method as well as the advantages. Because somewhere what happens is sometimes you need to have a control, you need to have a change, you need to have a manipulation of some variables so that it does not affect the research. But sometimes you need to manipulate to see the effect. For example, if I talk about the experimental research method, if you cannot change the cause, the effect will not be seen. But in ex post facto research method, what the aim of the researcher is to look into the causes, and only the causes, what made that particular behavior happen, is what is in the ex post research method. Okay, am I clear till here?
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. Now, next is experimental research. I've just talked about experimental research. Okay, what is experimental research? I'll just go out by differentiating. In your book, they have differentiated between two kinds of experiments. One is experimental research and other one is the field experiment. Now, what is field experiment? Field experiments are the experiments or the research that take place in the field. For example, when I say an experimental research is done, excuse me, experimental research is done in a very controlled environment. For example, to do an experiment, you need one particular lab, or you need a psychology lab, you need a research room, you need something where an experiment can be conducted, can be done in a very controlled environment. But when I say field experiment does not require any controlled environment. It can be done in the naturalistic environment. What is the difference now? For example, when I was just talking about the experimental research, I gave the example that I want to see how many students have the exam anxiety, and those students who have the exam anxiety, I conducted a meditation on them and this shows that the experiment was done to see whether the meditation does give an effect or not. So I'm doing the experiment by doing it in a controlled environment where there should be no noise. The environmental factors should be favorable to the experiment that is being conducted. Ye na ho, there is no fan, there is no AC, and the respondents, they are feeling very, very hot, and therefore it will affect the experiment. So experimental research is done in a controlled environment where there can be so many lackings as well if we don't see them, or if we don't change them. Whereas in a field experiment, as the word say, the experiments or the study or the research are done in a field way, not in a controlled environment, but in a natural environment. For example, I'm quoting an example for the field experiment. For example, there are students who are playing football in a ground. So as a field experiment researcher, your main work would be to see those students who are playing football, how they are playing. Are they playing according to the rules and regulations of the game or not? Are there any players who are showing aggression, or who are throwing any tantrums onto the others? Hope they are playing in a well organized way. So we are trying to observe the people or the students who are playing football in the ground, which becomes as a researcher who is observing the students in a field experiment, and that is what is termed as the field studies, or we call them the field experiments, or we call them the field research, where where you're trying to do a research in a naturalistic way. Now, field experiments can also be done, you as a participant observation method, or as a non-participant observation method. Now, what is participant observation and what is non-participant observation? For example, if you are as a researcher in participant research method, what you will do is you will go to those children, and you will also be the part of that particular game that the students are playing or the adolescents are playing, and you will observe them while you play with them. So in participant observation, you get close to the to the people that you are trying to observe. On the other hand, non-participant observation requires that you are only observing. You are not actually the part of that particular team. Only your work is to observe the people who are playing in the ground. That becomes the non-participant field experiment or the research. Now, next is your difference between what is the difference between the experimental research method and the field experimental research method. Experimental research, the first is that the subjects are homogeneous. In field experiment, the subjects may vary in a number of characteristics. If I'm doing a research, for example, the example that I have just given you, that for example, if I have to study the exam anxiety of the students who are supposed to appear for the board exams, it means all the participants in that particular experiment are same. And when I say they are same, it means they are homogeneous in nature, because everyone is appearing for the exam. So therefore, the subjects in the experiment are similar in nature, similar in the sense that they all belong to the same age and they are appearing for the board exam. So the situation is similar for them. The environmental conditions are similar for them, and therefore the homogeneity comes in the experimental research. But when I say the field experiment, the characteristics of the subjects may vary. For example, the example that I've just given you for field experiment is observing the behavior of the children who are playing outside in a ground. Now, there can be students who are from different schools. There can be students who belong to the rural area. There can be students who belong to the urban area. There can be students who who have different family backgrounds. So the number of characteristics changes, and therefore in field experiment, the subjects are not homogeneous, they are heterogeneous, which means their characteristics will be different. Am I clear till here to everyone? Okay. Next is the experimental subjects are in controlled situation. As I just said, that when you do an experimental research, you do in a controlled conditions. You could do it in a very controlled manner. But in field experiment, the subjects are not in a controlled, but in the natural settings and conditions, because they are doing in a field. The research is being conducted in the field, and that becomes the naturalistic observation or the naturalistic research. Okay. Now, in experimental research, the cause-effect relationship can be clearly established. As I said this before as well, that in experimental research, we study the cause-effect relationship, that what made what, what influenced what. That is what we study in the experimental research. But in field experiment, we don't study the relationship of cause-effect, because under field experiment, what we are trying to do is we are trying to the cause-effect relationship can be studied not to much an extent that we study in experimental research. In field experiment, we only trying to observe the behavior. We are not doing the cause-effect relationship. We are not trying to study, for example, if I'm trying to study the behavior of the children who are playing in a field experiment, I'm only trying to observe their behavior. I'm not studying any relationship. मैं ये नहीं देख रहा if the child is showing an aggressive behavior, why is he showing? I'm just looking what is happening in the while the students are playing. But in experimental research method, I'm looking into the cause effect, what made what, so that I do the experiments accordingly. Next is prediction based on experiment is possibly, and one can even accurately predict a phenomena given the same condition. We predict that, and when we say we predict, it means we are assuming. And when we say we assume, obviously when we do the experimental research or any kind of a research, we always create a hypothesis. Now my hypothesis before conducting the meditation on the class 12 board students is that yes, meditation works. I have read it all through. I've read it. I've listened from so many people that meditation does helps to release your anxiety or exam anxiety during exam days. So that is, I assume it. So that assumption of mine becomes my prediction as a researcher if I'm doing an experiment. But in field experiment, the prediction can only be possible to some extent, but not to a large extent. For example, if I'm observing students who are playing, I can only say ki, this child, he is performing well, therefore he looks a great player. So prediction can only be done to some extent. But when I say the assumption, when I'm doing an experiment, it is being done by proving the results. But a field experiment ke andar, if I'm assuming something, if I'm predicting something, it's not producing any results out of that, because I'm just doing a prediction for the sake of prediction. And that is why it is said that in field experiment, prediction can only be done to some extent, but not to a larger extent as it can be done in the experimental research method. Now, in experimental research method, there is always a quantitative results. If I'm doing my experiments, I'm looking into the stress first. I'm looking into the meditation sessions first, and therefore, because I'm quantify something, how many meditation sessions did I do? How many? How much did the child scored on exam anxiety? So I'm quantifying something by doing a research, by doing an experiment. But in field experiments, it requires both, not just the quantitative but also the qualitative analysis. मैं observe भी कर रहा हूँ. Observation is not a quantitative method, it's a qualitative method. And because field experiments employs both qualitative as well as the quantitative research analysis. Okay, clear till here to everyone?
Yes, sir.
Great. Okay. Now, the next important research method is case study. Now, what is case study? As the word say, case study, it's a study, it's an in-depth kind of a study of an individual. Case study, as the word say, it means case, which means an individual study. So case study is called as an in-depth kind of a study of an individual. Under case study, we can only do an in-depth study of one particular case at one particular time. And because we are studying only one particular case at one particular time, therefore it is called as a case study. Now, case study, under case study, what happens is, for example, you are working as a psychologist and parents come to you of a child that and says that ये बच्चा बहुत शैतानियां करता है, कोई भी घर पे आता है उसको मारता है, उसको पीटता है, उसको to some extent also that he speaks nuisance. So in a case study, what you will do is you will try to analyze the problem. Where did the problem happen? कहाँ से शुरू हुई है problem? For example, the research says sometimes when when a lady is pregnant, उस time पे भी it's very important to have a healthy or nutritious diet, or the female should be away from the stress. But sometimes because of the stress factors, because of the diet factors, it affects the child who is in the womb. So वहाँ से कई बार जो है problems they start coming up. So we should study in a case study. We start from there. That was the delivery of the child proper? Did the child cried when the child came out of the womb? So all those factors count as important factors when we try to do the research, when we try to do the case study, because sometimes these factors are accountable of any psychological problem in future. So we do start from there and then we go ahead. बच्चा 1 साल का हुआ, फिर 2 साल का हुआ, 3 साल का हुआ, बच्चे ने स्कूल जाना शुरू किया. What happened during school? Was the child could able to grasp all the things that were being taught to the child in the class? What was the attitude of the child in the class? Was the child able to do the proper homework? Was the child able to understand all the concepts that were being clear to the child in the class? So all those factors are studied in a case study, because as I said before as well, in a case study we try to study the in-depth of the child from the period of when the child was in a womb till the current time. That is what is termed as the case study. Now, there are few types of case studies. The first is the illustrative case studies. As the word say illustrative, it means it is a descriptive kind of study. You do a descriptive, you do a detailed analysis of the particular individual at one single time, and you go in depth to that particular case. That is what is called the illustrative case study. Next is exploratory case study. Under exploratory case study, you explore what could be the possibilities of the occurrence of a behavior. If a child is, if a child is this, what made this? What made the child act like this? What could be the possibilities? What all can be done to see, to do the in-depth study of the child? So you explore at a very minute way in the exploratory case study. As the word say, you explore the every possibility, you explore the every probability that can come across. Next is cumulative case studies. Cumulative case studies. Under cumulative, for example, when the child was in first year of his growth, when the child entered the second year, third year, fourth year, you collect it yearly, and when you accumulate, when you put them into one particular thing, that becomes the cumulative case studies. And the last one is the critical instance case study, where you critically analyze what could be the important. For example, in first year what was important, second year what was important, you highlight those important points, because sometimes those important points are the indicators sometimes of the occurrence of a probably a wrong behavior, or something that has created a trouble in someone's life. So those big instances, those examples play an important role in giving the counseling to such people who need counseling sessions. Now, next is steps for case study. Again, I won't go deep into it. Determining the present status. You need to see who the child is, what the child has, what are the problem, what is the current situation of the child, what is the history of the child. So उन चीजों को सबको जब हम we try to analyze, that is the first point. Second is identify the most probable antecedent of the case. What made that particular behavior? वो behavior क्यों show हुआ? उसका start कहाँ से हुआ? Why did it started? How did it started? Why did it started? When did it started? Knowing all such factors is identifying the most antecedent factors, what made that particular occurrence of said behavior. Next is verification of antecedent or the hypothesis. Verify it from different sources. Start assuming, start predicting. If the child was in first class, if he was in first this year, second year, he could be he was this year of age. So we do verify from the different sources by analyzing on the different parameters. So that is the verification of the antecedent factors. Verification of antecedent ka matlab jaise what made that occurrence of that particular behavior. We need to verify them as well. Was that particular thing right or not? And because sometimes we assume it, that is why verification of antecedent factors is also termed as the hypothesis, assuming such factors. Next is your diagnosis and remedial measures. You need to diagnose it. It's very important that knowing the symptoms of the particular behavior of the child or the person, it's very important. You need to diagnose. When you go into the the disorders that you will be doing in second year, if you pick clinical psychology as your major, you will be going through different disorders, and every disorder has particular kinds of symptoms before you diagnose a person with a typical before you diagnose a particular person with a particular disorder. So it's very important to do a proper diagnosis, so that the counseling sessions can be scheduled accordingly, can be arranged accordingly, and then is the follow-up. It's very important to do a follow-up, because for example, you counsel a child for about 1 year, and then you didn't follow up, you didn't ask the child once, you didn't ask the parent of the child once, that is the child doing okay now, is he fine now. So it's very important to do the follow-up, because then you know what's happening around, so that you know that whatever you did with the child was okay, was right. If the child is okay, if he's doing fine, if the follow-up is fine, if the parents give the positive feedback, it means that yes, the sessions that you have done is fine. The work that you done as a psychologist was okay, and that boost is up. So follow-up needs to be done at equal intervals. Now, what are the ways of case studies, writing analysis of case study, panel experts? It's very important to have the experts' viewpoints, before we actually jump into some decisions. Cross-examination has to be done sometimes. Yeah, that's it for today. Any questions, anyone? Can I have any question, please? Is there any question from anyone? Yeah.
Yes, I have. So, could you please tell me that field experiment, it is a qualitative and quantitative both?
Sorry, which one?
So, field, you said that, no? Field experiment.
Yeah,
it can be qualitative and quantitative both?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. They are both.
Ma'am, could you please give me an example for that?
Ma'am, when you do the field experiment, do you understand what quantitative and qualitative is, right?
Yeah.
So when you do field experiment, when you are doing an observation, what happens sometimes that when you doing an field experiment, when you do the observation or when you take the interview, they become the qualitative research methods. But sometimes what happens is, for example, if you understand that the child is a problematic child, a child is ADHD, he has attention deficit, you need to understand to what extent does the child is ADHD? Is he a mild ADHD, or is he a severe ADHD, or a profound ADHD? What kind of level of ADHD the child has? So in that particular sense, obviously you will be using a questionnaire, and you will be coming to a level where you can you will come with a number where you can say that whether the number that has come up has shows whether the child is a severe case or a mild case. So that becomes the quantitative research as well. So it employs both.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Most welcome, ma'am. Anyone else?
यदि किसी विद्यार्थी का कोई प्रश्न है तो प्लीज अभी आप पूछ सकते हैं। ओके, थैंक यू विवेक जी।
थैंक यू सर।
अभी सभी विद्यार्थियों के लिए एक जानकारी भी है, कल आपकी 2 कक्षाएं रहेंगी, तो कल आपको थोड़ा सा धैर्य के साथ जुड़े रहना है। कल 2:30 बजे से आपकी एक कक्षा MPC 003 की रहेगी, 2:30 से 3:30, और फिर 4 से 5 ये वाली कक्षा रहेगी। तो 2 दिन आपको लगातार 2 कक्षाओं में बैठना। ये व्यवस्था के अंतर्गत इस कार्य को किया गया है, क्योंकि फिर आगे आपके काउंसलर के पास समय नहीं होगा, तो ये आपकी कक्षा छूट सकती है। तो इसलिए हमने कोशिश की है कि कम से कम आपको 2 दिन कष्ट आपको करना पड़े, 2 दिन की फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी रहे। सभी मन आपकी मेल पे भेज दिया गया है, वो लिंक अलग रहेगा, ये लिंक अलग रहेगा। ठीक है, ओके, थैंक यू विवेक जी।
एक्सक्यूज मी सर।
Sure,
Hello?
ma'am.
जी
सर मेरे को ना एक्चुअली ये पूछना था, मैंने कल ही अटेंड करनी शुरू करी है क्लासेस, उससे पहले मैंने नहीं करा है कोई क्लास को अटेंड,